Hi, thanks for being part of this podcast today. This is the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. I am so glad to cover a book today that I haven't done before. The author is Dan Story, and that's why I enjoy it so much. He's a clear writer. He's a good thinker. Has an MA in Christian apologetics. He's got a book called Defending Your Faith. I've done a podcast or two on that. Christianity on the Offense and Engaging the Closed-Minded, as well as some other things. What a nice guy. He and his wife are wonderful people. We've gotten to know them. They don't live that far from us. And just a terrific guy. So this book that he's put out is called The Christian Combat Manual. This will be the first podcast on it, so I'm going to read a little bit of the intro, talk about that, and then his first chapter. So he starts off, what a powerful opener. America is at war. Now he's referring to a cultural war. And haven't we seen that going on in the last, let's say, 20 years or so? It seems like America is split down the middle. We've got people who advocate for the Judeo-Christian worldview and others that want to tear it down. And so Dan is tying into that very clearly here. He said we've got a cultural war. We're fighting about ideas, beliefs, and behaviors. It's a moral struggle. And he says this could destroy our country as quickly as any war could. It's happened before, he said. He said, think about the fall of Rome. He said, historians have been really perplexed by that. It really shouldn't have happened. I mean, how in the world could a bunch of wild barbarians defeat the most powerful civilization of the world? He said, many historians who've written about it say Rome fell because of its ruined character of its own citizens. In other words, Rome wasn't defeated by outsiders, but by its own moral decline. And I think that's true. He has a quote here from David Wells, who's a historian, a book called Losing Our Virtue. And he makes a parallel between the fall of Rome and our state today in America. He said, if this has any validity at all, should we not view our own deep destructive social pathologies and the rotting of our national character with some alarm? America seems so strong, so invincible as it bestrides the world, its technology unmatched, its economic system robust, its government stable. But it says Rome was like that as well. It says when the barbarians arrived outside the gates of Rome, it said they found nobody at home. They just walked in the city and began their conquest. It said we've got a disintegrating lifestyle as well. So that's Wells that Dan is referring to. So Dan gives us a quick background. He says, if you look back in American history for most of our time, the Christian worldview dominated, didn't it? Judeo-Christian principles and values underlaid our government policies and the standards for social behavior, for our judicial system, for our educational system. But he says that's not true today. People are becoming indifferent, frankly, to the bad behavior that's going on here. People thought that was evil and they condemned it a long time ago, but not anymore. Dan says we've got vulgarity, we've got violence in our entertainment, there's cheating in our universities, corruption in our corporations, judicial system has legalized abortion, pornography, and so on. So, it's really a tough time. Dan says our Christianity, the worldview of Christianity has been under siege for more than 100 years, and it's been pushed off stage. And he said Christian losses mounted as far as this attack went on. And Dan said there are three ways that the Christian church has tried to respond to this attack. One, he said in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, some seminaries just tried to accommodate the intellectual climate. So they responded by kind of turning the church into a secular view, and their efforts failed tragically. So you had super liberal theology infiltrating a lot of the mainline denominations, and it just tore up their fundamental beliefs that used to identify Christianity. And so a church historian, Harold Lindsell, said this: it's not unfair to allege that among denominations like Episcopal, United Methodist, United Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, the Lutheran Church in America, and the Presbyterian Church U.S., there is not a single theological seminary that takes a stand in favor of biblical infallibility. Wow, that's a strong statement, isn't it? They don't have a single seminary that takes a stand to say we can trust the Bible. So he said, and I'm back to Dan now. So Dan says that, so these churches today just have turned into social clubs. The Bible's not really divine. Jesus is demoted to being a nice guy. He kind of gave us good advice how to live a happy life. He's not God incarnate. He said, well, that was one way that churches have tried to deal with that attack that's happened on them. But he said we ended up with a spiritual civil war, and a large chunk of the churches responded by isolating themselves from the whole society. And I said Christians still like that idea today. Some claim that we've lost the cultural war, and so all we can do is put up our razor wire and withdraw from contact with the world. So we got to isolate ourselves. But Dan says that's failed. It's marginalized conservative Christians is just a tiny subculture within the broad secular society. And many churches became anti-intellectual. They didn't trust anything coming out of the university, so they thought learning was the problem. Not the way the universities had gone, just learning in general. And a lot of the churches became dogmatic and legalistic. Pretty soon it was all about prohibitions. You should not do this, and you should not do that. And it said what happened was conservative Christianity lost its voice and influence in American culture. Christians became viewed as anti-intellectual, a bunch of radical fringe groups out there out of touch with mainstream America, and that's still going on today. Yeah, that's true. So there was a second reaction. First was just get along with the group, buy into the theories of the secular world. And the second was to isolate themselves. Here's the third response. He said probably this is the most prevalent today. He said we have a lot of Christians, including a lot of evangelicals, that have a dualistic approach to life. What does he mean by that? Dan says they've got well-defined boundaries between the spiritual and the secular parts of their lives. And so, for example, when they're at church, they have strict biblical values. So they talk about abortion and homosexuality, and they endorse those biblical views. They support missionaries. They encourage evangelism. They give tithes and offerings to Christian causes. But when they're at school or at work or with their neighbors or entertaining, they have secular values. So they're compartmentalizing the religious and secular parts of their lives into separate categories. And I have a talk that I've done on worldviews, and I echo exactly what Dan is talking about here. People, many Christians, not all, but many Christians are Christians on Sunday, and then they're secularists Monday through Saturday, right? In other words, what they spend their time doing and where their money goes and the things they think about and what they read and all that kind of stuff is very different on Sunday than it is the other 6 days of the week. So he said, Dan says, none of these three approaches, one is accommodation, another's isolation, the other's dualism. He said, that's not going to win any battles in our cultural war. He said the early church didn't do that. They didn't accommodate. They didn't isolate. They didn't promote living dualistic lives. You know what they did, Dan says? They engaged the culture, and they transformed the pagan world into a Christianized world. What a great challenge, huh? Yeah. Okay, so that's his intro. There's his challenge to us. Do we want to accommodate? No, bad idea. Do we want to isolate? Second bad idea. Just stand back and let the society go down the drain? No, I don't think so. And that third idea, he said here, was compartmentalizing and just being a Christian one day a week. Well, that's not very good either. So he says we've got to engage. We've got to change the society. And that means we have to be in it. All right, so let's pick up then in his first chapter. I'm going to flip to it here. He says, what is apologetics? Pretty obvious way to start, but he says it means defense. So I'm going to go pretty quickly over this because I think most of you already have some of the basics down here. So basically, what are we talking about? Apologetics is a study of the defense of the Christian faith to demonstrate that there's Christian truth and those truth claims are true. So what kind of evidence do Christian apologists like to use? He says just about any area of study can be applied. And by the way, this is what I love about apologetics. It's so great because if you love literature, you can approach apologetics through literature. If you love history, you can approach it through that. If you're a science-minded person, you can use that. So here are some of the ways that Dan says you can get involved and apply apologetics: logic, philosophy, law, medicine, history, archaeology, fulfilled prophecy, science, manuscript studies, and on and on. Isn't that great? So almost anybody who wants to defend the Christian faith can find a strength that he or she already has and use that. And so the Christian apologist, Dan says, also tries to demonstrate the problems with non-Christian religions and secular philosophies, to critique them and show the problems that they have. Second section of this opener, Dan talks about, why do we need apologetics? He said, I think there are three good reasons. One, this is pretty obvious again, but I think we need to be reminded, apologetics is crucial for evangelism. Why? Well, it removes fear and provides evidence to support Christian truth claims. In other words, I know for our apologetics class, we did a survey. We asked the people of the class, what are you getting out of this class? And over again, the number one answer was confidence. And that meant that then they felt that they could interact with people who are not Christians and have evidences, rather than just saying, well, I just believe it. It's just true in my heart. So it gets rid of fear of interacting and provides confidence by saying we have evidence to support our truth claims. So it's been part of evangelism for a long, long time. Here's a quote from J.P. Moreland that Dan uses, and I love things that J.P. Moreland writes about. J.P. says this: it's no accident that the flourishing of evangelistic activity in the 60s and 70s was woven around the writings of C.S. Lewis, Josh McDowell, and Francis Schaeffer. You know, those were all apologists who wrote for ordinary Christians. And then back to J.P. Today we need a revival of evangelistic fervor and spiritual power. And an absolutely crucial element that must take place before we will see this revival is a renaissance of apologetics and intellectual activity in the evangelical church. As somebody once wrote about the losing of the evangelical mind, people don't think in the church anymore. And we need to be thinkers. We need to use apologetics for evangelism. So Dan says sometimes Christian apologetics are referred to as pre-evangelism. So what it does is to identify and remove intellectual obstacles that keep people from really considering the gospel. In one of my talks, I have an illustration of a garden with somebody tearing out some weeds. And that's what we're trying to do as Christians. We're trying to pull the weeds out, pull out those misconceptions, the intellectual obstacles, and let people see what Christianity truly is. You know, we're living in a post-Christian society. A lot of people today don't even know what Christianity really means and what Jesus really did. So Dan says, of course, salvation is the work of the Holy Spirit. It's God that's going to convict and convince and convert. And apologetics is just one way that the Holy Spirit could open people's hearts. So he's not saying apologetics saves people, right? That's not it. But says we'll be there to at least open people's minds. He says, we're back to Dan here, we're living in an anti-Christian world. And he said, apologetics is a key ingredient in evangelism because people are sometimes ignorant of what Christians believe and practice, which is what I was talking about. He says they don't have a rudimentary understanding of Christianity. They assume the Bible is a religious myth. They assume Jesus is about the same as Muhammad or Buddha. They assume naturalistic evolution explains how life came about. And they assume that if God exists, he's going to judge people about how good they are, right? Those are the things we've heard over and over again in our society. So America today is post-Christian, right? They're relativistic. They reject absolute truths. They're pluralistic. Every culture and religion is equally legit, right? That's what we're hearing out there. So he said, Spirit-empowered apologetics holds the key. How do we reach people hardened to the gospel? Apologetics. It demonstrates Christianity is true, doesn't it? And we do have something relevant to say to today's culture. So there's the first reason we need apologetics for evangelism, to reach the world, which Jesus asked us to do. Here's a second thing that he says apologetics does. It prepares students for secular college. They've done studies, and I've seen these studies as well. It's something like 3/4 up to 80% of kids that came out of Christian homes go off to secular colleges and fall away from Christianity. That's pretty grim, isn't it? So apparently you could have a great foundation in the Bible, and that may not be enough to keep Christian students committed. You need apologetics. He quotes Nancy Pearcey. And Nancy Pearcey is another wonderful author. I hope you have a chance to read some of her books. By the way, her last name is spelled Pearcey. A little bit different. So Nancy Pearcey. Here's what she said. Today, basic apologetics has become a crucial skill for sheer survival. Talking about young people. Without the tools of apologetics, young people can be solidly trained in Bible study and doctrine, yet still flounder helplessly when they leave home and face the secular world on their own. Oh, that's for sure. She said, we need to make sure our own kids leave home with a conviction that Christianity is capable of holding its own when challenged in the marketplace of ideas. Exactly right. Christianity is the best worldview going. Now, does it have some issues that we struggle with? Yes. But other worldviews have way more difficult issues. So, back to Pearcey again. She says, to be effective in equipping young people and professionals to face the challenges of a highly educated secular society, the church needs to redefine the mission of pastors and youth leaders to include training in apologetics and worldview. Pastors must once again provide intellectual leadership for their congregation, teaching apologetics from the pulpit. Whoa. How many churches are you familiar with, and how many places have you gone to hear from the Word of God from some pastor, and apologetics doesn't come up at all? Yeah, me too. Pretty rare. Now, I know churches are swamped. They've got 101 things they're trying to do, but they really need to teach apologetics, not just to the young, but to the adults as well, so that we can go out and interact effectively with people who may not share our faith. This is one more thing that Pearcey says. A religion that avoids the intellectual task and retreats to the therapeutic realm of personal relationships and feelings will not survive in today's spiritual battlefield. That's a strong statement, isn't it? It will not survive, and I think she's exactly right. Well, those are two things that apologetics can do, right? So they're good for evangelism. They're good to help students stay Christian. And number 3, apologetics is affirming to our faith. So they've said apologetics could help new believers who want to rationally justify and understand their commitment to Jesus. Yeah, exactly right. And Dan tells his story here. He said when he became a Christian, he was an adult. He said there's nobody in his family who was a practicing Christian, didn't have any friends who were Christians. He said after he told people that he'd converted, became a Christian, he said people close to him started asking questions or made put-down comments to him about his faith. And he said, I had a lot of questions that needed to be answered. You know, I think that's part of the problem. We want to get people to the cross of Christ, which, of course, is hugely important, but then we leave them there, and they may have a ton of questions. I know my son had a friend who it was exactly like that. He, as an adult, became a Christian, I think, and I think he was baptized and, the whole 9 yards, but I don't think he got anybody in his life to really talk to him and answer questions and all, and so I think he's drifted off. So I think Dan's making a good point here. So in Dan's case, he said he had questions and nobody was helping him, so he started investigating apologetics. He said he started reading apologetic books by Josh McDowell, Paul Little, and C.S. Lewis. So let me stop there for just a second. I think you probably all recognize the name Josh McDowell. He has put out so many good books. And, of course, C.S. Lewis, the famous English writer. You may not know Paul Little. He's got 2 books. They're short, but they're really powerful. One is Know Why You Believe, and the other is Know What You Believe. Right, so take a look at those 2. I may have done some podcasts on them, but those are wonderful. They're really good books to get started. Know What You Believe, Know Why You Believe. And back to Dan, he said, I can't believe how much those writings strengthened his faith. He said apologetics removed his doubts. It assured him that Christianity was solid, and it sat on a foundation of facts. It said it even increased his desire to study the Bible. But he said, most importantly, apologetics gave him greater confidence. There's that word, to share his faith. And so this is such a good book, and he's got so many good chapters in here. I can't tell you enough how powerful this book is. The Christian Combat Manual. Dan Story is the author. Get comfortable with Dan Story material if you can. Find it out there. It's well worth the time and effort. Well, thanks for being part of this podcast, and I hope your day is going well.